In a world where people walk past suffering without a second glance, one quiet rancher in rural Montana proved that the greatest acts of courage don't always come with loud voices or grand speeches. They come from those who watch, who notice, and who refuse to look away when something feels deeply wrong. This is the true story of Harold Whitmore, a man who spoke fewer than 50 words most days, and the discovery he made one cold October morning that would expose a criminal operation spanning 3 states and rescue 17 people from a living nightmare. What began with a simple observation of a limping worker would end with the sheriff standing on Harold's porch, shaking his hand with tears in his eyes, saying he had never witnessed anything like it in his 32 years of law enforcement. But, before we reach that moment, we must go back to the beginning, to a dusty ranch road and a man who believed that watching was just as important as speaking. The morning mist hung low over the Whitmore ranch like a gray blanket that refused to lift. It was the kind of October morning that made old bones ache and young workers pull their collars tight against the chill. The sun had barely cracked over the eastern mountains when Harold Whitmore stepped onto his front porch with a cup of black coffee steaming between his rough, calloused hands. He was 63 years old, though the deep lines carved into his weathered face made him look at least a decade older. His hair had gone completely silver years ago, and he kept it cropped short beneath the faded brown cowboy hat he had worn every single day for the past 37 years. His wife Martha had bought him that hat on their first anniversary, and even though she had been gone now for 8 years, Harold still put it on each morning as if she were watching from somewhere beyond the pale blue sky. Harold Whitmore was not a man of many words. This was something everyone in the small town of Clearwater knew well. When he went into town for supplies, he would nod at the store clerk, point at what he needed, and pay an exact change without uttering more than a grunt of acknowledgement. At the local diner where the ranchers gathered on Saturday mornings to complain about cattle prices and weather patterns, Harold would sit at the end of the counter, eat his eggs and toast in silence, and leave a generous tip without ever joining the conversation. Some folks in town thought he was strange. Others thought he was rude. A few of the older residents who remembered him as a young man knew the truth, that Harold had simply never found much use for words when his eyes could do the talking. His late father had been the same way, and his grandfather before that. The Whitmore men were watchers, observers, people who believed that most folks talked too much and listened too little. The ranch Harold ran had been in his family for 4 generations. It spread across nearly 3,000 acres of Montana grassland, with rolling hills that turned golden in summer and white with snow in winter. He ran about 400 head of cattle, a small operation by modern standards but enough to keep one quiet man busy from sunrise to sunset. For most of his adult life, Harold had worked the ranch alone or with just 1 or 2 hired hands. But 3 years ago, his knees had started to give him trouble, and the doctor in town had warned him that he needed to slow down or risk needing surgery that might leave him unable to walk at all. So Harold had reluctantly agreed to hire more help, though finding good workers in rural Montana was becoming harder with each passing year. Young people didn't want to spend their days mending fences and herding cattle. They wanted to move to the cities where the jobs were easier and the paychecks came with benefits and air conditioning. That was when Harold had first encountered the Garrett Labor Company. A slick-looking man in a clean pickup truck had driven up to the ranch one afternoon about 2.5 years ago, introducing himself as Vincent Garrett. He was maybe 40 years old, with carefully styled dark hair and a smile that showed too many teeth. He wore a pressed button-down shirt that had no business being on a working ranch, and his handshake was the kind that tried too hard to prove strength. Harold had disliked him immediately, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. It was just a feeling, a twitch in his gut that told him something about this man wasn't quite right. But Vincent Garrett had made him an offer that was hard to refuse. He said he ran a labor company that provided workers to ranches and farms across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. The workers were mostly immigrants, he explained, people who were eager to work hard for fair wages. He would handle all the paperwork, the housing, the transportation. All Harold had to do was pay a monthly fee, and he would have 3 reliable workers showing up at his ranch every morning, ready to do whatever needed doing. Harold had hesitated. He didn't like the idea of workers he didn't choose himself, people he couldn't look in the eye during an interview and get a sense of their character. But his knees ached something fierce that day, and there were fences that needed mending and cattle that needed moving, and he was only one man getting older by the minute. So he had agreed, shaking Vincent Garrett's too firm hand and signing the papers without reading all the fine print. Looking back now, Harold would tell himself that was the first mistake, though it would take him a long time to realize just how serious that mistake had been. The workers arrived the following Monday. There were 3 of them, just as Vincent had promised. 2 men and 1 woman, all of them appearing to be in their 30s or early 40s. They came in a white van driven by a heavy-set man with a thick neck and small eyes who never introduced himself or got out of the vehicle. He just waited while the 3 workers climbed out, then drove away without a word, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the morning air. The workers stood there looking at Harold with expressions he couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear exactly, but something close to it. A kind of careful blankness, like they had trained themselves not to show what they were really feeling. Harold nodded at them, pointed toward the barn, and got to work showing them what needed to be done. He didn't ask their names that first day. He figured they would tell him when they were ready. It took almost a week before he learned they were called Maria, Eduardo, and Gabriel. Maria was the woman, small and wiry with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a tight braid. Eduardo was the older of the 2 men, maybe 45, with a thick mustache going gray at the edges and hands that showed he had done hard labor all his life. Gabriel was younger, perhaps 30, with a quiet intensity in his dark eyes that reminded Harold of a wild horse not yet broken. They all spoke English, though with heavy accents that Harold sometimes struggled to understand. They worked hard, harder than any hired hands Harold had employed in years. They arrived each morning in the same white van, driven by the same silent heavy-set man, and they left each evening the same way. They never complained, never asked for breaks, never chatted idly the way most workers did. They simply worked, hour after hour, until the van returned to take them away. Harold watched them. That was what he did, after all. He watched. And, over those first few months, he began to notice things that troubled him. Small things at first. The way Maria flinched whenever the van pulled up, like she was afraid of what might be waiting inside. The way Eduardo's hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The way Gabriel sometimes stared off toward the distant mountains with an expression of such profound sadness that it made Harold's chest ache just to see it. They never talked about their lives outside the ranch. Whenever Harold tried to ask them simple questions about where they lived or whether they had families, they would grow quiet and find excuses to get back to work. It was strange behavior, and Harold didn't like strange. Strange usually meant something was wrong, something that people didn't want others to know about. But Harold told himself it wasn't his business. These workers belonged to Vincent Garrett's company, not to him. They showed up, they worked, they left. Whatever happened during the hours they weren't on his ranch was outside his concern. That was what he told himself, anyway. It was easier than digging deeper, easier than asking questions that might have answers he didn't want to hear. So Harold pushed his suspicions down into a quiet corner of his mind and focused on the work that needed doing. The fences got mended. The cattle got moved. The ranch kept running. And if the workers seemed sad or scared or strangely silent, well, that was their business and not his. At least, that was what Harold believed until the morning he noticed Gabriel limping. It was a Tuesday in mid-October, about 2.5 years after the workers had first arrived. The morning was cold and gray, with the threat of early snow hanging in the air. Harold was standing on his porch with his coffee, watching the white van pull up the long dirt road to his ranch, same as it did every morning. The van stopped near the barn, and the 3 workers climbed out. Maria first, then Eduardo, then Gabriel. But something was different about Gabriel that morning. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to disturb an injury that was already causing him pain. When his feet hit the ground, he stumbled slightly, catching himself on the side of the van. And then Harold saw it. Gabriel was limping badly, favoring his left leg like it couldn't bear his full weight. His face was pale, drawn tight with the effort of hiding his discomfort, and there was a purple bruise spreading across his left cheekbone that hadn't been there the day before. Harold watched as Gabriel straightened himself up and tried to walk normally toward the barn. The young man's jaw was clenched tight, and sweat was already beading on his forehead despite the cold morning air. Maria and Eduardo exchanged a quick glance, the kind of look that held an entire conversation without words. Then, they moved to walk on either side of Gabriel, positioning themselves so that they partially blocked Harold's view of his unsteady gait. It was a practiced movement, smooth and natural, like they had done it many times before. Like they were used to hiding injuries from watching eyes. The heavy-set driver of the van stood outside the vehicle for a moment, watching the workers walk toward the barn. His small eyes found Harold standing on the porch, and something passed across his face. Not concern, not guilt, but something that looked almost like a warning. Then, he climbed back into the van and drove away, leaving Harold alone with questions he didn't want to ask and suspicions he could no longer ignore. Harold didn't approach the workers right away. Instead, he went about his morning routine, gathering the tools they would need for the day's work, checking on the horses in the stable, reviewing the list of tasks he had written down the night before. But, the whole time, his mind kept circling back to Gabriel's limp and that purple bruise spreading across his face. A man could get injured in plenty of ways on a ranch. Harold himself had broken bones, twisted ankles, gotten kicked by horses more times than he could count. But, Gabriel hadn't been injured yesterday. Harold had watched him climb into the van at the end of the workday, moving easily and without pain. Whatever had happened to Gabriel had happened during the night, somewhere away from the ranch, somewhere Harold knew nothing about. When he finally walked into the barn, he found the 3 workers already busy with their morning tasks. Maria was mucking out the horse stalls, her small frame surprisingly strong as she lifted heavy forkfuls of soiled hay. Eduardo was checking the water troughs, making sure they weren't frozen over from the cold night. And Gabriel was attempting to lift a bale of hay, his face twisted with pain as his injured leg threatened to give out beneath him. Harold watched for a moment, then walked over and took the hay bale from Gabriel's hands without a word. The young man looked up at him with surprise and something else, something that might have been fear. Harold set the hay bale down and looked at Gabriel directly. He didn't say anything at first, just looked, taking in the details of the younger man's condition. Up close, the bruise on his face was even worse than it had appeared from the porch. It spread from his cheekbone up toward his eye socket, the purple center ringed with sickly yellow at the edges. Gabriel's lip was split on the left side, and there was dried blood in the corner of his mouth that he had tried but failed to completely wipe away. His left eye was slightly swollen, making it harder for him to see out of that side. And, when Harold's gaze dropped lower, he noticed that Gabriel was holding his left arm close to his body, like his ribs might also be injured. Someone had beaten this man. That was clear enough. Someone had beaten him badly, professionally, with the kind of methodical violence that was designed to cause pain without causing obvious damage. Harold had seen injuries like this before, a long time ago, when he had served in the army and witnessed what happened to prisoners who refused to cooperate with their captors. This wasn't the result of a bar fight or a simple accident. This was punishment. This was a message. Harold looked at Gabriel for a long moment, then looked at Maria and Eduardo, who had both stopped working and were watching the exchange with barely concealed anxiety. Their faces were blank, carefully emptied of expression, but Harold could see the tension in their bodies, the way they were poised to jump in if needed, to explain away what couldn't really be explained. They were afraid. All 3 of them were afraid. And Harold suddenly understood that they weren't just afraid of getting in trouble or losing their jobs. They were afraid of something much worse. They were afraid of whoever had done this to Gabriel. Harold did something then that surprised even himself. He reached out and put his hand on Gabriel's shoulder, gently, the way you might touch a frightened animal to let it know you mean no harm. Gabriel flinched at first, his whole body going rigid with the instinct to protect himself from another blow. But Harold's hand remained steady, warm, offering nothing but kindness. And, slowly, very slowly, Gabriel's rigid muscles began to relax. "What happened?" Harold asked quietly. His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, but in the silent barn it seemed to echo off the walls. Gabriel's eyes widened with surprise. In 2.5 years of working on this ranch, he had never heard Harold Whitmore speak more than a handful of words at a time. Maria and Eduardo looked equally shocked, frozen in place like statues, unsure of what to do or say. Gabriel opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. His eyes darted toward the barn door, as if expecting someone to come through it at any moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, choked with emotions he was struggling to contain. "Please," he said. "Please, do not ask. It is better if you do not know." Harold studied the young man's face, reading the fear written there as clearly as words on a page. He had watched people for 63 years, and he knew what genuine terror looked like. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers facing combat for the first time, in the faces of ranchers watching their herds die during drought years, in the expression of his own wife when the doctors told them the cancer had spread too far. Gabriel's terror was the same kind, deep and, bone deep and, hopeless. It was the terror of someone who had stopped believing that help was possible. Harold let his hand fall from Gabriel's shoulder. He stood there for a moment longer, thinking about what he had just seen and what it might mean. Then, he turned and walked out of the barn without another word. But, as he crossed the yard toward his house, his mind was working faster than it had in years. Something was very wrong with the Garrett Labor Company. Something was very wrong with the way these workers lived, somewhere beyond the borders of his ranch. And Harold Whitmore, the silent rancher who had spent his whole life watching instead of acting, knew that he couldn't look away from this any longer. He spent the rest of that day observing the workers more closely than he ever had before. Not watching them work, but really observing them, the way a detective might study suspects at a crime scene. He noticed things he had somehow missed in the 2.5 years they had been coming to his ranch. He noticed that their clothes, while clean, were all the same. Simple gray shirts and worn blue jeans, like a kind of uniform. He noticed that none of them wore watches or carried phones or had any of the personal items that normal workers kept in their pockets. He noticed that when lunchtime came and Harold brought them sandwiches from his kitchen, they ate with the desperate hunger of people who weren't sure when their next meal might come. And he noticed the scars. Maria had thin white lines on her wrists that she tried to hide beneath the cuffs of her shirt. Eduardo had a raised ridge of scar tissue running along the back of his neck, like someone had struck him with something sharp years ago. Gabriel, in addition to his fresh injuries, had old marks on his forearms that looked like cigarette burns, circular and evenly spaced, the kind of marks that didn't come from accidents. These were people who had been hurt before, many times, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. These were people who carried their suffering on their bodies like a map of everything they had endured. By the end of the workday, Harold had made a decision. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew that he had to do something. He couldn't just stand by and watch these people suffer, couldn't pretend that whatever was happening to them wasn't his problem just because it happened off his property. For 2.5 years, he had looked the other way. For 2.5 years, he had told himself it wasn't his business. But, seeing Gabriel limp into his barn that morning, seeing the fear in all three workers' eyes, seeing the scars that told stories of pain he couldn't even imagine, Harold knew that looking away was no longer an option. When the white van returned that evening to collect the workers, Harold watched it pull up from his usual spot on the porch. The heavy-set driver got out this time, which was unusual. He walked toward the workers with a lazy swagger that reminded Harold of a prison guard, someone who held power over others and enjoyed using it. The driver said something to Gabriel in a low voice, too quiet for Harold to hear from the porch. Whatever it was made Gabriel flinch and look down at the ground, his shoulders hunching inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Maria reached out and touched Gabriel's arm, a quick gesture of comfort, but she pulled away just as quickly when the driver's eyes found her. Harold watched the workers climb into the van one by one. Maria first, then Eduardo, then Gabriel, moving slowly and painfully with his injured leg. Just before Gabriel disappeared into the van, he looked back over his shoulder toward the ranch house. His eyes met Harold's across the dusty yard, and, in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them without words. Gabriel's look held fear and desperation and something that might have been hope, the hope that someone had finally noticed, that someone might finally care enough to help. The van drove away, leaving Harold standing alone on his porch with the weight of that silent plea pressing down on his shoulders. He stood there for a long time after the van had disappeared, watching the dust settle on the empty road. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that he barely noticed. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten on the porch railing. His mind was far away, turning over possibilities, considering what he might do and what it might cost. Harold Whitmore was not a man who acted without thinking. That was one advantage of being silent most of the time. While other people filled the air with words, he had learned to fill his mind with observations and plans. He knew that whatever was happening to these workers was bigger than he could handle alone. He knew that confronting Vincent Garrett or the heavy-set driver directly could put the workers in even more danger. He knew that he needed help, real help, the kind that could only come from people with authority and resources. But Harold also knew something else, something he had learned over 63 years of watching people and reading their faces. He knew that not everyone who wore a badge could be trusted. He knew that corruption could spread like disease through small-town institutions, that men like Vincent Garrett didn't operate in the open unless they had protection from people who should have been stopping them. If Harold was going to help these workers, he had to be careful about who he talked to and how he approached the problem. One wrong move, one wrong word to the wrong person, and the workers might disappear forever. Or worse. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pencil, writing down everything he had observed about the workers and the Garrett Labor Company over the past 2.5 years. The clothes they wore. The van that transported them. The heavy-set driver with the warning in his eyes. The fear that showed in every movement the workers made. Gabriel's injuries and the way Maria and Eduardo had tried to hide them. The scars that spoke of long histories of abuse. Vincent Garrett's too firm handshake and too bright smile. The monthly payments Harold made that seemed strangely low for 3 full-time workers. All of it went down on paper, detail by detail, building a picture of something that Harold was beginning to suspect was far darker than simple labor contract violations. It took him 3 hours to write everything down. When he was finished, he had filled 6 pages with his careful, cramped handwriting. He read through his notes twice, adding details he had initially forgotten, crossing out things that seemed irrelevant. Then, he folded the pages carefully and placed them in an envelope, which he sealed and wrote a single word on the front: evidence. Harold didn't sleep well that night. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from different angles, looking for the best way forward. He thought about calling the local sheriff, a man named Ray Patterson whom Harold had known for 30 years. Ray was a decent man, as far as Harold could tell, honest and hard-working and dedicated to the people of Clearwater. But Ray was also close to retirement, tired and worn down by decades of dealing with small-town problems. Would he have the energy to take on something this big? Would he even believe Harold's concerns, or would he dismiss them as the paranoid worries of a lonely old rancher? Harold also thought about calling the state police or the FBI or whoever handled crimes that crossed state lines. Vincent Garrett had mentioned working across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. If something criminal was happening with his labor company, it might be the kind of crime that required federal attention. But Harold didn't know how to contact federal authorities, didn't know what to say or who to ask for. He was just a rancher, a quiet man who had spent his whole life on a few thousand acres of Montana grassland. He wasn't equipped for this kind of thing. He wasn't prepared to take on a criminal organization that had been operating right under everyone's noses for God knows how long. But then, Harold thought about Gabriel's face as he climbed into that van. He thought about the fear and the hope mixed together in those dark eyes. He thought about Maria's scars and Eduardo's trembling hands. He thought about all the things he had watched and noticed over 2.5 years, all the signs he had chosen to ignore because it was easier than getting involved. And Harold knew that he couldn't let his fear or his uncertainty stop him from doing what needed to be done. These people were suffering. These people needed help. And Harold was the only one who had noticed, the only one who might be able to make a difference. The next morning, Harold got up before dawn and drove into town. The streets of Clearwater were quiet at that hour, with only a few early risers walking their dogs or heading to the diner for breakfast. Harold parked his truck in front of the sheriff's office and sat there for a long moment, gathering his courage. Then, he took a deep breath, grabbed the envelope from his passenger seat, and walked inside. The deputy on duty was a young woman named Sarah Chen, fresh out of the police academy and eager to prove herself. She looked up from her paperwork with a surprised expression when Harold walked through the door. In all her months working in Clearwater, she had never seen the silent rancher set foot in the sheriff's office. Everyone in town knew Harold Whitmore didn't talk to anyone if he could help it. "I need to see Sheriff Patterson," Harold said. His voice came out rough and used, like a rusty gate being forced open after years of neglect. "It's important." Deputy Chin stared at him for a moment, clearly unsure how to respond. Then, she recovered her professional composure and nodded. "He's in his office. Let me see if he's available." She disappeared through a door at the back of the station. Harold waited, turning the envelope over in his hands, feeling the weight of what he was about to set in motion. A minute later, Deputy Chen returned with Sheriff Ray Patterson following close behind. Ray was 64 years old, just a year older than Harold, with a belly that had grown soft from too many years behind a desk and hair that had turned the color of dirty snow. His uniform was wrinkled and his eyes were tired, but when he saw Harold standing in his lobby, something sparked to life behind those weary eyes. Curiosity, maybe. Or concern. "Harold," Ray said, extending his hand. "Been a long time since you came to see me. Must be something serious." Harold shook the sheriff's hand, then held out the envelope. "I think there's something bad happening," he said slowly, choosing each word with care. "Something real bad. And I think I'm the only one who noticed." Ray took the envelope and turned it over, reading the single word written on the front. Then, he looked back at Harold with an expression that had shifted from curious to intensely focused. "Come on back to my office," he said. "Tell me everything." And so Harold did. For the first time in his life, the silent rancher opened his mouth and let all the words come pouring out. He told Ray about Vincent Garrett and the Garrett Labor Company. He told him about the workers who came to his ranch every morning in a white van driven by a heavy-set man with cold eyes. He told him about Maria and Eduardo and Gabriel, about their fear and their scars and their desperate silence. He told him about Gabriel's injuries, about the beating that had left him limping and bruised, about the way the other workers had tried to hide it from Harold's watching eyes. He told him about all the small details he had noticed over 2.5 years, all the pieces of a puzzle he had finally started to put together. Ray listened without interrupting, his tired eyes growing sharper and more alert with every word. When Harold finished talking, the sheriff sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "You know what you're describing," he said quietly. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, this isn't just a labor violation. This sounds like human trafficking." Harold nodded. He had been afraid to use those words himself, afraid that saying them out loud would make the horror of it too real to bear. But hearing them from the sheriff somehow made it easier, confirming that his suspicions weren't just the paranoid imaginings of a lonely old man. "I want to help," Harold said. "Whatever needs to be done, I want to help." Ray studied him for a long moment, measuring the resolve in those quiet eyes. Then, he nodded slowly. "We're going to need more than just your observations," he said. "We're going to need evidence. Real evidence. The kind that can hold up in court." "Just tell me what to do," Harold replied. And so began a partnership that no one in Clearwater could have predicted. The silent rancher and the tired sheriff, working together to uncover a criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But, as Harold walked out of the sheriff's office that morning, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Direction. The sense that he was finally doing something that mattered, something that might make a real difference in people's lives. The sun was rising over the mountains as Harold drove back to his ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere out there, Gabriel and Maria and Eduardo were waking up in whatever prison they called home, preparing for another day of forced labor and fear. They didn't know that help was coming. They didn't know that the quiet man who watched them every day had finally decided to act. But Harold knew. And he was determined not to let them down. This was just the beginning. The real work, the dangerous work, was still ahead. But Harold Whitmore, the man who had spent his whole life watching from the sidelines, was finally ready to step into the arena. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. For Gabriel. For Maria. For Eduardo. For all the people he couldn't see but knew must be out there, trapped in the same nightmare, waiting for someone to notice them. The silent rancher had noticed. And, now, nothing would ever be the same. The days following Harold's meeting with Sheriff Patterson moved with a strange combination of urgency and forced patience. Ray had explained that they couldn't simply raid the Garrett Labor Company's operations without solid evidence. If they moved too quickly, the whole organization might disappear, taking the workers with them to some new location where they would never be found. Or worse, the people running the operation might decide that witnesses were too dangerous to leave alive. Human trafficking networks, Ray had explained with grim experience, often treated their victims as disposable. When things got too hot in one place, they simply eliminated the evidence and started fresh somewhere else. So Harold found himself playing a role he had never imagined for himself. He became an undercover informant, gathering evidence right under the noses of the people who thought they had fooled him for 2.5 years. Every morning, he watched the white van arrive with the same careful attention he had always given everything on his ranch. But now his watching had purpose. Now every detail he noticed was another piece of the puzzle that might eventually bring the whole rotten system crashing down. The first thing Ray asked him to do was get the license plate number of the white van. It seemed like a simple enough task, but Harold had to be careful not to draw attention to himself. He couldn't suddenly start walking toward the van when it arrived, couldn't make it obvious that he was looking at the plates. So he came up with a plan. He moved one of his horses to a paddock near where the van always parked, claiming that the horse needed exercise in a different area. Every morning, he would be out there when the van arrived, pretending to check on the horse while his eyes memorized the numbers and letters on the license plate. It took him 3 days to get all the information because the van always arrived with the back end facing him, and he had to wait for an angle that let him see the front plate clearly. The license plate led to the first breakthrough. Ray ran the number through his system and discovered that the van was registered to a company called Western Agricultural Services, not the Garrett Labor Company. Western Agricultural Services had an address in Billings, about 4 hours east of Clearwater. On paper, it looked like a legitimate business that provided equipment and supplies to farms and ranches across the state. But Ray dug deeper, pulling records and making quiet inquiries through contacts he had developed over his 32 years in law enforcement. What he found painted a troubling picture. Western Agricultural Services was owned by a shell company based in Wyoming. That shell company was owned by another shell company in Idaho. And that company, several layers down the rabbit hole of corporate paperwork, connected back to a man named Marcus Webb. Ray had never heard the name before, but when he searched through federal databases, what he found made his blood run cold. Marcus Webb had been investigated twice by federal authorities for suspected involvement in human trafficking, but both investigations had been dropped due to lack of evidence. He was smart, careful, and very good at making problems disappear. He had connections to organized crime networks that stretched from the Mexican border all the way up to Canada. And, according to the most recent intelligence, he had been expanding his operations into the Pacific Northwest and Northern Plains states. Ray called Harold into his office again to share what he had learned. They sat together in the small room with the door closed and the blinds drawn, two old men who suddenly found themselves in the middle of something neither of them had ever trained for. "This is bigger than I thought," Ray admitted. "Much bigger. If Marcus Webb is involved, we're talking about a major criminal organization with resources and reach that go way beyond what my department can handle. I've already reached out to the state police and the FBI. They're interested, but they need more before they can commit resources to an investigation." "What do they need?" Harold asked. "Everything," Ray replied. "They need to know where the workers are being held. They need evidence of how they're being transported and controlled. They need financial records showing how the trafficking operation makes money. They need witnesses who are willing to testify. Without all of that, they can't build a case that will stick." Harold thought about Gabriel's terrified eyes, about Maria's scarred wrists, about Eduardo's trembling hands. These people had been trapped for years, maybe longer, in a nightmare that most folks couldn't even imagine. They had been beaten, controlled, and forced to work for people who saw them as nothing more than property. And, now, even with the sheriff and federal agencies aware that something was wrong, their freedom still depended on gathering more evidence, jumping through more hoops, building a case that might take months or even years to complete. "What can I do?" Harold asked. Ray leaned forward in his chair, his tired eyes meeting Harold's steady gaze. "There's something," he said slowly. "But it's risky. Really risky. And I won't ask you to do it unless you understand exactly what you're getting into. Tell me." Ray explained his plan. The Garrett Labor Company, like most trafficking operations, probably kept their workers in a central location. Somewhere isolated, away from prying eyes, where they could control every aspect of their victims' lives. If Harold could find out where that location was, it would give the authorities the information they needed to begin planning a rescue operation. The problem was finding it. The workers were picked up and dropped off by the white van, and they clearly weren't allowed to talk about where they lived or what happened when they weren't working. Breaking through that wall of silence would require building trust with the workers, convincing them that Harold genuinely wanted to help and had the power to actually make a difference. "It's dangerous for you and for them," Ray warned. "If anyone in the organization suspects that you're gathering information or that the workers are talking to you, the consequences could be severe. These people don't hesitate to use violence. Gabriel's beating might have been a warning. Next time, it could be worse." Harold sat quietly for a long moment, turning the sheriff's words over in his mind. He thought about the risks, about what might happen if he was caught. He thought about his ranch, about the life he had built over 63 years, about all the quiet peace he had found in this remote corner of Montana. He could walk away right now. He could tell Ray that he had done enough, that gathering more evidence was a job for professionals, that he was just an old rancher who had no business getting involved in something this dangerous. But, then, he thought about Gabriel's face. He thought about the hope he had seen there, mixed with all that fear. He thought about what it must be like to wake up every day in chains, physical or otherwise, knowing that no one was coming to help, that the world had forgotten you existed. "I'll do it," Harold said. Over the next several weeks, Harold began the delicate process of trying to connect with the workers on a deeper level. It wasn't easy. They had been conditioned to keep their mouths shut, to trust no one outside their immediate group, to assume that everyone was either a threat or a potential informant who would report their words back to their captors. Every time Harold tried to engage them in conversation, they would give short, guarded answers before finding excuses to get back to work. They were polite, always polite, but there was a wall between them and Harold that seemed impossible to breach. Harold realized he needed to change his approach. He couldn't just ask questions and expect answers. He had to show the workers, through actions rather than words, that he was different from everyone else they had encountered. He had to earn their trust the same way you earned the trust of a wild animal, slowly, patiently, with consistent kindness and no sudden movements. He started bringing them better food. Instead of the simple sandwiches he had been providing, he began preparing real meals in his kitchen each morning. Thick stews with fresh vegetables from the garden he maintained behind his house. Homemade bread that he baked the night before. Fresh coffee instead of the watered-down stuff from the pot that had been sitting on the burner for hours. He didn't make a big deal about it, didn't draw attention to the change. He simply left the food in the barn where the workers could find it and went about his day as if nothing was different. At first, the workers were suspicious. They exchanged nervous glances when they discovered the food, clearly unsure whether this was some kind of trick or test. But hunger is a powerful force, and eventually hunger won out over caution. Harold watched from a distance as they ate, saw the way their eyes widened with surprise at the flavors, saw the way Maria closed her eyes and savored each bite like it was the first real food she had tasted in years. Maybe it was. He also started giving them small comforts that might seem insignificant to most people but meant everything to someone with nothing. He noticed that Maria's work gloves were worn through at the fingertips, so he left a new pair on top of the fence post where she always started her morning tasks. He saw that Eduardo's boots had holes in the soles, so he placed a pair of his own old boots, still in good condition, where Eduardo couldn't miss them. He observed that Gabriel always seemed cold in the early mornings, so he hung a heavy flannel jacket on a hook in the barn with a note that simply said, "For you." The workers accepted these gifts with the same quiet caution they showed toward the food. They didn't thank Harold directly, didn't acknowledge his kindness with words. But Harold noticed something changing in the way they looked at him. The fear was still there, would probably always be there given what they had endured. But now there was something else mixed in with the fear. Curiosity. Wonder. The faint beginning of trust. It was Gabriel who finally cracked first. 3 weeks after Harold had started his campaign of quiet kindness, Gabriel approached him one morning while the other workers were busy on the far side of the barn. The young man's injuries had mostly healed by then, though he still moved with a slight limp that Harold suspected might be permanent. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fear warring with desperate need, caution fighting against something that looked almost like hope. "Why?" Gabriel asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you do these things for us?" Harold studied the young man's face for a long moment before answering. "Because you're people," he said simply. "And people deserve kindness." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away. "No one has been kind to us in a very long time," he whispered. "We had almost forgotten what it feels like." "Tell me," Harold said gently. "Tell me where you come from. Tell me how you got here." And so Gabriel told him. The story came out in fragments, whispered conversations stolen during brief moments when the other workers were occupied and no one else was watching. Gabriel was from Guatemala, the second oldest of 7 children born to poor farmers who could barely grow enough food to feed their family. When he was 19, a man had come to his village offering jobs in the United States. Good jobs, the man had said, with fair wages that could support an entire family. Gabriel's father had sold their only cow to pay the fee that would get Gabriel across the border and into this land of opportunity. The journey north had been a nightmare. Gabriel and 30 other young men and women had been crammed into the back of a cargo truck for days at a time, with only small bottles of water and stale bread to sustain them. Several people had died along the way, their bodies dumped at the roadside like garbage. When they finally reached the United States, they were not greeted with the promised jobs and fair wages. Instead, they were told that they now owed a debt. The fee their families had paid was only a fraction of the cost of their transportation. The rest had to be worked off, and, until the debt was cleared, they belonged to the organization. That was 6 years ago, Gabriel said. Every year, they tell us the debt has grown. There are fees for housing. Fees for food. Fees for the van that takes us to work sites. No matter how hard we work, we can never pay it off. We can never be free. Harold listened with growing horror as Gabriel described the conditions at the compound where the workers were held. It was an old farm property about 40 miles north of Clearwater, in a remote valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. High fences topped with razor wire surrounded the main buildings, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter around the clock. The workers slept in crowded dormitories with no heat in winter and no cooling in summer. They were fed twice a day, just enough to keep them alive and able to work. Any attempt to escape was punished with beatings, and anyone who tried to contact outside authorities simply disappeared, never to be seen again. There are others, Gabriel continued, his voice trembling. Not just the 3 of us who come to your ranch. There are maybe 60 people at the compound. Some work on farms like us. Others are sent to factories or construction sites. Some of the women, he paused, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat, some of the women are sent other places. Places we don't talk about. Harold felt his stomach turn at the implications of what Gabriel was describing. This wasn't just forced labor. This was a full-scale criminal operation that treated human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited in whatever way made the most money. The workers at the compound weren't just victims of economic abuse. They were slaves in everything but name, trapped in a system designed to keep them powerless, voiceless, and invisible. "I want to help you," Harold said quietly. "But I need you to trust me. I need all of you to trust me. Can you do that?" Gabriel's eyes searched Harold's face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint that this might be another trap. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he slowly nodded. "I will talk to the others," he said. "But, you must understand, they are very afraid. We have all seen what happens to people who try to escape or who talk to outsiders. The consequences are always terrible. Some people have been beaten so badly they can never work again. Others have simply vanished. We have learned that it is safer to stay silent, to keep our heads down, to survive one day at a time. I understand, Harold replied. But surviving isn't the same as living. And you deserve to live. That conversation marked a turning point in Harold's relationship with the workers. Over the following days, Gabriel spoke quietly to Maria and Eduardo, sharing what Harold had said and the kindness he had shown them. The walls of distrust that had separated the workers from Harold began to slowly crumble. Maria started nodding at him in the mornings, a small acknowledgement that seemed enormous given how guarded she had always been. Eduardo began leaving small carvings on the fence post where Harold left their meals, intricate wooden animals whittled from scraps he found around the ranch, his way of saying thank you without risking words. Harold shared everything he learned with Sheriff Patterson. Ray documented every detail in a growing file that he kept locked in a safe in his office. The location of the compound, the number of workers being held there, the armed guards, the punishments for escape attempts, all of it went into the file along with Harold's earlier observations. Ray had been in regular contact with federal agents who were building their own case against Marcus Webb's organization. Every piece of information Harold provided added to the evidence they would need to eventually take action. But the federal agents were cautious, perhaps too cautious for Harold's liking. They wanted more surveillance, more confirmation of what the workers had described, more proof that would stand up in court. They talked about wiretaps and undercover operations and lengthy investigations that might take months or even years to complete. Meanwhile, 60 people remained trapped in a compound 40 miles away, living in conditions that no human being should have to endure. Harold grew frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation. Every day that passed was another day of suffering for Gabriel and Maria and Eduardo and all the others. Every night he lay awake in his bed, he thought about what might be happening to them in that compound. Were they being fed enough to eat? Were they warm enough in the cold October nights? Were they being beaten for imagined infractions, punished for crimes they hadn't committed? It was during one of these sleepless nights that Harold made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wait for the federal investigation to run its course. He couldn't sit back and gather evidence while people suffered. He had to do something more direct, something that would force the authorities to act even if they weren't quite ready. It was risky, probably the most dangerous thing he had ever contemplated in his quiet, careful life. But Harold had spent 63 years watching from the sidelines, and he was tired of being a spectator. It was time to become a participant. The next morning, Harold drove into town and visited the local hardware store. He bought a small digital camera, the kind used for wildlife photography that could be easily concealed. He also purchased a voice recorder no bigger than his thumb and a notebook with waterproof pages. The store owner, a man named Pete who had known Harold for decades, commented on the unusual purchases. Taking up a new hobby, Pete asked with a friendly smile. Something like that, Harold replied, and offered nothing more. That afternoon, Harold sat down with the camera's instruction manual and spent several hours learning how to use it. Technology had never been his strong suit, but this was important enough that he forced himself to master the basics. How to turn it on and off, how to zoom in and out, how to adjust the settings for different lighting conditions. By the time he was finished, he could operate the camera almost as naturally as he could handle a rope or saddle a horse. His plan was simple but dangerous. He would follow the white van when it left his ranch in the evening. He would find out where the compound was located and document everything he could see from a distance. The photographs and recordings would provide the hard evidence the federal agents needed to justify immediate action. It wouldn't be enough for a full prosecution, but it might be enough to force a rescue operation that would free the workers before the investigation was complete. Harold waited for the right opportunity. It came 3 days later, on a Friday evening when the autumn sun set early behind the mountains. The white van arrived at its usual time to collect the workers, and Harold watched from his porch as Gabriel, Maria, and Eduardo climbed inside. The heavy-set driver exchanged a few words with Gabriel, then got back behind the wheel and started down the long dirt road that led away from the ranch. Harold waited until the van had disappeared around the first bend, then walked quickly to his truck. He kept his headlights off as he followed the vehicle, maintaining enough distance that the driver wouldn't notice him in his mirrors. It was a skill he had learned decades ago, during his brief time in the army when he had trained for reconnaissance missions that he never actually had to carry out. He had never expected to use those skills as a 63-year-old rancher, but life had a way of surprising you. The van headed north on the main highway for about 20 miles, then turned onto a smaller road that wound through the mountains. Harold followed at a distance, grateful for the fading light that made his truck harder to spot. The road grew rougher and narrower as they went, eventually becoming little more than a dirt track that cut through dense forest and across open meadows. Whoever had chosen this location had picked it specifically because it was hard to reach and easy to defend. After about 40 minutes of driving, the van turned off the dirt track and passed through a gate in a high chain-link fence. Harold slowed his truck to a crawl, then pulled off the road into a dense stand of pine trees where he would be hidden from view. He grabbed his camera and climbed a small ridge that overlooked the compound below. What he saw through the camera's zoom lens confirmed everything Gabriel had described and more. The compound sprawled across several acres of cleared land, surrounded by the fence Gabriel had mentioned, topped with coils of razor wire that glinted in the last light of the fading sun. Inside the fence were several large buildings, including what looked like dormitories, a main house, and several storage structures. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung over their shoulders, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. In a parking area near the main gate, Harold counted 7 vehicles besides the white van, including 2 large trucks that could be used to transport workers in bulk. Harold began taking photographs. He documented the layout of the compound, the positions of the guards, the license plates of every vehicle he could see. He photographed the dormitory buildings where the workers were held and the main house where he assumed the people running the operation lived. He captured images of the guards' faces, hoping that some of them might be identified through criminal databases. Every click of the camera shutter felt like a small victory, another piece of evidence that would eventually bring this nightmare to an end. He was so focused on his photography that he almost didn't hear the footsteps approaching from behind. It was only the snap of a twig underfoot that alerted him to danger, giving him just enough time to turn around before a heavy hand grabbed his shoulder. "Well, well," said a voice that Harold recognized instantly. It was Vincent Garrett, the man who had first approached him about hiring workers from his company 2.5 years ago. His too bright smile was gone now, replaced by an expression of cold fury that made Harold's blood run cold. "Looks like our quiet rancher isn't so quiet after all." 2 other men emerged from the trees, both carrying rifles pointed directly at Harold's chest. The heavy-set driver from the van was one of them, his small eyes filled with a satisfaction that suggested he had suspected Harold all along. The other was a younger man Harold didn't recognize, but the casual way he held his weapon indicated he had used it before and wouldn't hesitate to use it again. Vincent plucked the camera from Harold's hands and scrolled through the photographs with a disgusted expression. "You've been busy," he observed. "Very busy. I have to admit, I underestimated you. I thought you were just another dumb rancher who wouldn't notice anything as long as the work got done. Turns out you've been paying attention this whole time." Harold said nothing. There was nothing to say. He had been caught, his evidence confiscated, his investigation exposed. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. Vincent stepped closer, his face inches from Harold's. "Here's what's going to happen," he said in a voice that was almost pleasant. "You're going to come with us. You're going to tell us exactly what you've told the police and who else knows about our operation. And then, well, we'll figure out what to do with you." The 2 armed men grabbed Harold's arms and began forcing him down the ridge toward the compound. Harold's mind raced, trying to think of some way out of this situation, some plan that might save him. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and there was no one around to help him. As they approached the gate, Harold caught a glimpse of Gabriel standing near one of the dormitory buildings, watching him being dragged toward captivity. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Harold saw the despair in Gabriel's expression, the crushing weight of hope extinguished. Harold had been their chance for rescue, their one connection to the outside world that might have led to freedom. And now that chance was gone. But, even as the guards shoved him through the gate and into the compound, Harold felt something that surprised him. It wasn't fear, though he had plenty of that. It wasn't regret, though he wished he had been more careful. What he felt, strangely, was calm. A quiet certainty that this wasn't over yet, that his capture wasn't the end of the story. He had set things in motion that couldn't be stopped simply by silencing one old rancher. Ray Patterson knew everything Harold knew. The federal agents had files full of evidence. Somewhere out there, people were working to bring this operation down, and they wouldn't stop just because Harold had been captured. Whatever happened next, Harold was determined to survive long enough to see it through. He had spent his whole life watching and waiting. Now it was time to be patient once more, to wait for the opportunity that would surely come. Because it always did. And, when it came, Harold would be ready. They took him to a small concrete building near the edge of the compound, a structure that looked like it might have been a storage shed in some previous life. Inside, it had been converted into a holding cell, with a single metal chair bolted to the floor in the center of the room and bright lights that made Harold squint after the darkness outside. They pushed him into the chair and tied his hands behind his back with rough rope that cut into his wrists. Vincent stood in front of him, arms crossed over his chest, that cold smile back on his face. "Now," he said, "let's have a conversation. Tell me everything you know, and everything you've told others. Don't leave anything out. I'll know if you're lying." Harold looked up at him with eyes that had watched thousands of sunrises over Montana grasslands, that had seen birth and death and everything in between, that had learned to read truth and lies in the faces of men and animals alike. And, in that moment, despite his fear, despite the hopelessness of his situation, Harold Whitmore smiled. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," he said quietly. "And neither did I, until now. But I know one thing for certain. This is the beginning of the end for you. Not for me. For you." Vincent's smile faltered, just for an instant. Then, he laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "We'll see about that," he said. "We'll see." And so began the longest night of Harold Whitmore's life. The concrete room grew colder as the night wore on, or maybe it was just Harold's body beginning to feel the effects of sitting in one position for too long. His shoulders ached from having his hands tied behind his back, and his wrists were raw where the rope had rubbed the skin away. The bright lights above him never dimmed, creating a constant glare that made his eyes water and his head throb with the beginnings of a headache that would only get worse as the hours passed. Vincent Garrett had left after that first confrontation, taking his cold smile and threatening words with him. In his place, 2 guards had been posted outside the door, their voices occasionally drifting through the thin walls as they complained about the cold or made crude jokes that Harold tried not to listen to. Inside the room, Harold was alone with his thoughts and his fears and the stubborn determination that had kept him going through 63 years of Montana winters and drought summers and all the other challenges that ranch life had thrown at him. He thought about Martha. He always thought about Martha in his quiet moments, even now when his quiet moments were forced upon him by captivity rather than choice. She had been gone 8 years now, taken by the same cancer that had claimed her mother and grandmother before her. Sometimes Harold wondered if that was why they had never been able to have children, if Martha's body had somehow known from the beginning that it was marked for a shortened life. They had tried for years, endured tests and treatments and the crushing disappointments that came month after month when the pregnancy tests came back negative. Eventually they had stopped trying, had made peace with the idea that they would grow old together, just the 2 of them, watching over the ranch that had been in Harold's family for generations. Martha would have liked Gabriel, Harold thought. She had always had a soft spot for young people who were struggling, who carried pain in their eyes that they tried to hide from the world. She would have been the one to bring them proper meals and warm clothes long before Harold worked up the courage to do it himself. And she would have insisted on helping them, would have marched right down to the sheriff's office and demanded action instead of waiting months for Harold to finally do something. "I'm doing something now, Martha," Harold whispered into the empty room. "Better late than never, I suppose." The door creaked open, and Harold looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light. It wasn't Vincent Garrett or the heavy-set driver or any of the armed guards he had seen earlier. It was a woman, small and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a familiar tight braid. Maria! She slipped into the room quickly, closing the door behind her with barely a sound. In her hands she carried a cup of water and what looked like a small piece of bread wrapped in cloth. Her eyes darted nervously toward the door every few seconds, checking for any sign that the guards might enter. "You should not have come here," she whispered as she held the cup to Harold's cracked lips. "They will kill you if they find out." Harold drank the water gratefully, feeling it soothe his parched throat. "Why did you come?" he asked when she lowered the cup. Maria's eyes met his, and, in them Harold saw something he hadn't expected. Determination. Fire. A stubborn courage that matched his own. "Because you came for us," she said simply. "You are the first person in years who has tried to help us. We cannot abandon you now." She fed him small bites of the bread, tearing off pieces and placing them carefully in his mouth so he wouldn't have to chew with his hands still bound. As he ate, she spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a hushed whisper that was filled with urgency. "Gabriel told me about your conversations," she said. "About the sheriff, about the investigation. We all know now what you have been trying to do. The others are scared, but they are also hopeful. For the first time in years, they believe that maybe, there is a chance." Harold swallowed the last bite of bread before responding. "The sheriff knows where I am," he said. "At least, he knows I was planning to follow the van. If I don't come back, he'll know something went wrong. He'll send help." Maria shook her head sadly. "Vincent has already taken care of that," she said. "He made you call the sheriff from your own phone. Do you not remember?" Harold's blood ran cold. He did remember now, though the memory was fuzzy from exhaustion and the disorientation of his capture. Vincent had held his phone in front of his face and made him speak, threatening to hurt one of the workers if he said anything suspicious. Harold had told Ray that he had decided not to follow the van after all, that he had changed his mind about getting more involved. He had sounded tired and defeated, and Ray had accepted the story without question. "So no one is coming," Harold said, more to himself than to Maria. Maria was quiet for a moment. Then, she leaned closer, her lips almost touching his ear. "There may be another way," she whispered. "But, it is dangerous. Very dangerous. Tell me." Maria glanced at the door again, then continued in a voice so soft Harold had to strain to hear. "There is a man here, one of the guards. His name is Jackson. He is not like the others. He has been kind to us when no one is watching. I think maybe he does not want to be here, does not want to be part of this." I have seen the doubt in his eyes. Harold considered this information. A sympathetic guard could change everything. Someone on the inside who might be willing to help, to look the other way at a crucial moment, maybe even to contact the authorities. It was a slim hope, but slim hope was better than no hope at all. "Can you talk to him?" Harold asked. "Find out if he's willing to help?" Maria nodded slowly. "I will try. But it will take time. I cannot approach him directly without raising suspicion. I will have to be careful, find moments when we can speak without being observed." "Be careful," Harold said. "If Vincent finds out what you're doing, there's no telling what he might do." Maria's jaw tightened with resolve. "I have been careful my whole life," she said. "Careful got me trapped in this place for 4 years. Maybe it is time to stop being so careful. Maybe it is time to take risks." She rose to her feet and gathered up the cup and cloth, leaving no evidence of her visit. At the door, she paused and looked back at Harold with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of all the suffering she had endured and all the hope she had finally allowed herself to feel. "We will get out of here," she said. "All of us. Together. I believe that now." Then, she was gone, the door closing silently behind her, leaving Harold alone again with the bright lights and the cold concrete and the rope cutting into his wrists. But something had changed in the air of that small room. Something had shifted in the balance of power, even if no one else could see it yet. Maria believed. The workers believed. And belief, Harold had learned over his many years of watching the world, was often the first step toward making impossible things happen. The next several days blurred together in Harold's mind. He lost track of time in that windowless room, where the lights never changed and the only markers of passing hours were the occasional meals brought by silent guards and the visits from Vincent Garrett, who continued to press him for information about what he had shared with the authorities. Harold gave up just enough to seem cooperative, confirming what Vincent already knew or suspected while hiding the deeper connections to the federal investigation and the evidence that had already been passed along. It was a delicate balance, saying enough to avoid punishment while protecting the larger operation that might still save them all. Vincent, for his part, seemed uncertain about what to do with his captive. Harold was a problem that didn't fit neatly into the normal categories of the trafficking operation. He wasn't a worker who could be controlled through debt and violence. He wasn't a business partner who could be bought off or threatened. He was just an old rancher who had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have, and eliminating him would create questions that might draw more attention than keeping him alive. For now, you stay here, Vincent finally decided after 3 days of interrogation. You're useful as insurance. If the authorities get too close, well, a missing rancher makes for good negotiating leverage. But if you cause any trouble, if you try anything stupid, my patience will run out very quickly. So Harold waited. He ate the meager meals brought by guards who never spoke to him. He slept as best he could in the hard metal chair, catching brief moments of rest before the cold or the discomfort woke him again. And he watched, always watched, noting the patterns of the guards' movements, the sounds that filtered through the walls from the compound outside, the small details that might prove useful when the moment for action finally came. Maria visited him twice more during those first days, always late at night when the guards outside his door were drowsy and less attentive. She brought him food and water and something even more valuable than sustenance. She brought him information. Jackson is willing to listen, she reported during her second visit. He is young, maybe 25, and he came to work here because he needed money and did not ask too many questions. But he has seen things that trouble him. The beatings. The way the women are sometimes taken away and come back changed, broken. He told me he has trouble sleeping at night. Has he agreed to help? Harold asked. Not yet. He is afraid. They all are, even the guards. This organization, it has a long reach. People who betray it have a way of disappearing, and not just the workers. Jackson has heard stories about guards who asked too many questions or who tried to quit. They end up dead in car accidents or overdoses that look accidental but never are. Harold understood that fear. It was the same fear that had kept him silent for 2.5 years, the same fear that paralyzed good people everywhere when they encountered evil that seemed too powerful to fight. But fear could be overcome. He had seen it happen before, in the faces of soldiers going into battle, in the eyes of ranchers watching their land dry up during drought years who somehow found the strength to keep going anyway. Fear was powerful, but hope was more powerful still. And courage, true courage, was simply fear that had decided to act anyway. Keep talking to him, Harold said. Don't push too hard, but don't give up either. Make him understand that he has a choice. He can be part of the problem, or he can be part of the solution. But he can't pretend he doesn't know what's happening here. That choice has been taken from him. Maria nodded and promised to continue her careful campaign of persuasion. Before she left, she shared one more piece of information that made Harold's heart leap with cautious hope. There are people looking for you, she said. We overheard Vincent talking on the phone yesterday. He was angry, shouting about people asking questions in town, about the sheriff not believing the story you told on the phone. He mentioned something about moving the operation, about getting ready to disappear if things got too hot. Ray, Harold thought. Ray didn't believe the phone call. Ray knew something was wrong and was still investigating, still pushing for answers. The investigation hadn't been abandoned after all. Help might still be coming, if only they could hold on long enough. But the news about moving the operation was troubling. If Vincent decided to relocate the workers to another location, Harold might never be found. The workers might disappear into some other corner of the trafficking network, lost forever in a system designed to keep them invisible. Whatever was going to happen needed to happen soon, before Vincent made the decision to cut his losses and run. The 5th day of Harold's captivity brought a change in routine that signaled something was about to happen. Instead of the usual silent guards delivering his meals, the heavy-set driver appeared at his door with 2 other men Harold didn't recognize. They untied his hands, massaged feeling back into his cramped fingers, and gave him food and water that was actually warm for once. "Boss wants to see you," the driver said. "Clean yourself up. You look like hell." They gave Harold a bucket of water and a rag to wash his face and hands, along with a clean shirt to replace the one he had been wearing for 5 days straight. He didn't know what this sudden attention to his appearance meant, but he suspected it wasn't good. When criminals started treating their prisoners better, it usually meant they were either about to let them go or about to make them disappear permanently. Given the circumstances, Harold was betting on the latter. The driver led him through the compound to the main house, a large wooden structure that looked like it might have been a ranch house itself at some point before it was converted into the headquarters of a criminal operation. Inside, the house was surprisingly well appointed, with leather furniture and expensive rugs and artwork on the walls that seemed wildly out of place given the suffering that funded its purchase. Vincent Garrett sat behind a large wooden desk in what appeared to be a study, papers spread out in front of him, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Sit down, Harold," Vincent said, gesturing to a chair across from the desk. "We need to talk." Harold sat, keeping his expression neutral, giving away nothing of the fear that churned in his stomach. "I've been doing some thinking," Vincent continued, swirling the liquid in his glass thoughtfully. "About you. About this whole situation. You've created quite a mess for me, you know. People asking questions, investigations that were supposed to be dormant suddenly getting new attention. It's very inconvenient." "I imagine it is," Harold replied evenly. Vincent smiled that cold smile of his. "I like you, Harold. I know that probably sounds strange given the circumstances, but it's true. You're not like most people. Most people would have looked the other way, minded their own business, pretended they didn't notice anything wrong. But you noticed. You paid attention. You actually cared about what happened to people who meant nothing to you." "They're human beings," Harold said. "That should mean something to everyone." Vincent laughed softly. "See, that's what I'm talking about. That kind of naive idealism. It's refreshing, in its own way. Completely impractical, but refreshing." He set down his glass and leaned forward, his eyes meeting Harold's with an intensity that made the older man's skin crawl. "Here's my problem," Vincent said. "I can't let you go. You know too much, you've seen too much, and I'm quite certain you've told other people everything you know. If I release you, you'll go straight to the authorities with a detailed description of this compound and everyone in it. My organization would be finished within a week." "Then, what do you want from me?" Harold asked. "I want you to disappear," Vincent replied. "But I'm not a monster, despite what you might think. I'm a businessman. And I believe in giving people options, even when those options are unpleasant. So here's your choice." He pulled a piece of paper from the desk and slid it toward Harold. It was a contract of some kind, filled with legal language that Harold couldn't fully decipher at a glance. "This is a non-disclosure agreement," Vincent explained. "You sign it, and you agree to never speak of anything you've seen or experienced here. In exchange, I'll let you return to your ranch. You'll go on with your life as if none of this ever happened. The workers will be reassigned to other operations, and you'll never see them again. But you'll be alive, and you'll be free." Harold looked at the paper without touching it. "And if I refuse?" "Then, you become a liability that I can no longer afford to maintain. You'll disappear, Harold. Not in the pleasant legal sense of the word. You'll simply cease to exist. Your ranch will eventually be sold for unpaid taxes. Your name will be forgotten. No one will ever know what happened to you." Harold sat in silence for a long moment, considering the choice before him. Sign the paper and live, abandoning Gabriel and Maria and Eduardo and all the others to their fate. Or refuse and die, accomplishing nothing except the satisfaction of knowing he hadn't compromised his principles. But, even as he considered these options, Harold's mind was working on something else entirely. Vincent's offer told him something important. The businessman was scared. Despite his confident demeanor and his threats, Vincent was worried about what Harold might have set in motion. If he were truly in control of the situation, he would simply eliminate the threat and move on. The fact that he was offering deals meant that he saw Harold as having value, either as a potential asset or as insurance against something that was coming. "I need time to think about it," Harold said finally. Vincent's eyes narrowed. "How much time?" 24 hours. "You're asking me to make a decision that will affect the rest of my life. I deserve at least a day to consider it." For a long moment, Vincent studied Harold's face, looking for any sign of deception or manipulation. Then, he nodded slowly. 24 hours, he agreed. "But not a minute more. And if you're thinking about trying anything clever, remember that I have 60 workers in this compound who will pay the price for any trouble you cause. One word from me, and things can get very unpleasant for your friends very quickly." Harold was escorted back to his concrete cell, but now his mind was racing with possibilities. 24 hours wasn't much time, but it was something. It was a chance to make something happen, to set events in motion that might change everything. He just needed to figure out how. The answer came that night, in the form of a quiet knock on his door that preceded another visit from Maria. She slipped inside with her usual caution, but this time there was something different about her. An energy, an excitement that she could barely contain. "Jackson has agreed," she whispered, her voice trembling with barely suppressed hope. "He will help us." Harold felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "How?" "He has access to a phone," Maria explained. "A personal cell phone that the guards are not supposed to have, but that many of them keep anyway. He is willing to make a call for us, to reach out to someone who can help." "Tell him to call Sheriff Ray Patterson in Clearwater," Harold said immediately. "Tell him to say that Harold Whitmore is being held at this compound and needs immediate help. Ray will know what to do." Maria nodded, memorizing the information. She was about to slip out again when Harold caught her arm. "There's something else," he said. "Vincent has given me 24 hours to sign an agreement that would let me go free." "He's scared, Maria. Something is happening outside that has him worried. The investigation must be getting closer. If Jackson can make that call tonight, there's a chance that help could arrive before Vincent decides to run." Maria's eyes widened with understanding. "Then, we must move quickly," she said. "Tonight. Everything happens tonight." She left without another word, and Harold was alone again with his thoughts and his prayers. He prayed to God, to Martha, to whatever forces of goodness might be listening in the universe. He prayed that Jackson would follow through with his promise. He prayed that Ray would receive the message and act on it immediately. He prayed that somehow, against all odds, this nightmare would come to an end before morning. The hours that followed were the longest of Harold's life. Every sound from outside his door made him tense with anticipation. Every footstep in the hallway might be Maria returning with news, or it might be Vincent's men coming to end things early. He tried to rest, knowing he would need his strength for whatever was coming, but sleep was impossible. His mind kept spinning through possibilities, imagining everything that could go right and everything that could go wrong. It was sometime in the deep darkness of the early morning hours when Harold heard something that made his heart nearly stop. Distant, at first, but growing louder. The unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. He struggled to his feet, pressing himself against the door of his cell, trying to hear what was happening outside. Voices raised in alarm. The sound of vehicles starting. Gunshots, sharp and sudden, followed by more shouting. And, underneath it all, the steady thudding of those helicopter blades, getting closer and closer. The cavalry had arrived. The next few minutes were chaos. Harold heard doors being kicked open, commands being shouted, the sound of running feet and bodies hitting the ground. Someone was approaching his cell, moving fast, and Harold braced himself for whoever might come through that door. It crashed open to reveal a figure in tactical gear, rifle raised, flashlight mounted on the barrel cutting through the darkness of the cell. The figure swept the room, saw Harold standing with his hands raised, and lowered the weapon slightly. "Harold Whitmore?" the figure asked. His voice was young, professional, with the clipped efficiency of military training. "That's me," Harold confirmed. "We're federal agents," the man said. "Sheriff Patterson sent us. You're safe now." The words hit Harold like a physical force, and he felt his knees threaten to give out beneath him. Safe. After everything that had happened, after all the fear and uncertainty and desperate hope, it was finally over. He was safe. The agent helped Harold out of the cell and into the chaos of the compound. Everywhere he looked, there were people in tactical gear securing buildings, handcuffing guards, and moving with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed operation. Floodlights had been set up around the perimeter, casting harsh white light over a scene that looked like something from a war movie. And, in the middle of it all, standing by one of the dormitory buildings with tears streaming down his face, was Gabriel. The young man saw Harold emerge from the concrete building and broke away from the federal agent who was taking his statement, running across the compound to throw his arms around the old rancher in an embrace that said everything words could never express. "You did it," Gabriel whispered into Harold's shoulder. "You saved us. You saved all of us." Harold held the young man tightly, feeling the emotions of the past weeks finally breaking through the walls he had built around them. "We saved each other," he said. "All of us. Together." They stood there for a long moment, two men from different worlds united by something that transcended language and culture and circumstance. Around them, the rescue operation continued, but, for Harold and Gabriel, the world had shrunk to just the two of them and the bond they had forged through shared suffering and shared hope. A familiar voice cut through the noise of the operation, and Harold looked up to see Sheriff Ray Patterson approaching, his tired face split by a grin that made him look 20 years younger. "You crazy old fool," Ray said, clapping Harold on the shoulder. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me this past week?" "I have some idea," Harold replied with a small smile. Ray shook his head in amazement. "When Jackson called and told us where you were, we didn't have much time to plan. Had to coordinate with the FBI, the state police, 3 different county sheriffs. Biggest operation this part of Montana has ever seen. And it all started because you decided to pay attention to a limping worker." Harold looked around at the compound, at the buildings that had held so many people prisoner for so long, at the guards being led away in handcuffs, at the workers emerging from the dormitories with expressions of disbelief and joy. "Seems like paying attention was the right thing to do," he said quietly. Ray nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. "We got most of them," he said. "Vincent Garrett is in custody, along with the heavy-set driver and about a dozen guards. We've already started the process of identifying the workers and making arrangements for their care. But there's more work to do. This operation was just one piece of a much larger network. Marcus Webb is still out there, and he's going to be angry about what happened here tonight." Harold understood what Ray was saying. The victory was real, but it wasn't complete. There would be investigations and trials and the long, slow process of bringing the whole criminal organization to justice. There would be threats and dangers and the possibility of retaliation from people who had a lot to lose. But, for now, in this moment, Harold allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Pride. Not the boastful kind that looked for recognition and praise, but the quiet kind that came from knowing you had done something that mattered, something that made the world a little better than it was before. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains to the east, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Harold of the morning he had first noticed Gabriel limping into his barn. So much had happened since that moment, so much fear and danger and uncertainty. But here they were, alive and free and surrounded by people who had risked everything to make this rescue happen. "Let's go home," Harold said to Gabriel. "There's a ranch that needs looking after, and I could use some help." Gabriel looked at him with confusion in his eyes. "But I am not a worker anymore," he said. "I am free now.
I do not have to work for anyone.
Harold smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to his eyes. That's right, he said.
You're free. Which means you can choose what you want to do with your life.
And if you choose to help an old man run his ranch, not as a worker but as a friend, well, there's a room in my house that's been empty for a long time.
It could use someone to fill it.
The tears that had been threatening to fall from Gabriel's eyes finally spilled over, running down his cheeks in streams that glistened in the early morning light. He looked at Maria and Eduardo, who had gathered nearby to listen, and saw them nodding with encouragement.
I would like that, Gabriel said finally. I would like that very much.
And so it was that Harold Whitmore, the silent rancher who had spent his whole life watching from the sidelines, found himself at the center of something extraordinary. The rescue of 17 workers from the compound that night was just the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, the investigation would expand to include operations across 3 states, leading to dozens of arrests and the dismantling of a trafficking network that had operated in the shadows for nearly a decade. But all of that was in the future. For now, Harold stood in the ruins of a criminal empire with his arm around a young man who had become like a son to him, watching the sun rise over a world that had been forever changed by the simple act of paying attention. The sheriff's department would later call it the most significant anti-trafficking operation in Montana history. Newspapers would write stories about the quiet rancher who had brought down a criminal organization. Politicians would give speeches about the importance of vigilance and community. But Harold didn't care about any of that. What he cared about was the smile on Gabriel's face, the relief in Maria's eyes, the gratitude of 60 people who had finally been set free. What he cared about was the fact that sometimes, when good people paid attention and refused to look away, impossible things could happen. Martha would have been proud, Harold thought as he watched the sunrise. She would have been so very proud. And, somewhere, in whatever heaven might exist for good and loving souls, Harold believed she was watching. Watching and smiling. Just like she always had. The weeks following the rescue were unlike anything Harold had experienced in his 63 years of quiet living. His small ranch, which had seen nothing more exciting than the occasional difficult calving season, became the center of an investigation that drew attention from media outlets across the country. Reporters camped out at the end of his driveway, hoping to catch a glimpse of the silent rancher who had brought down a human trafficking network. Federal agents came and went, asking questions, collecting evidence, piecing together the full scope of the criminal operation that had hidden in plain sight for so many years. Harold did his best to cooperate with the investigation while protecting the privacy of the workers who had become his family. Gabriel had moved into the spare bedroom that had sat empty since Martha's passing, and the young man's presence brought a warmth to the old house that Harold hadn't realized he had been missing. Maria and Eduardo had been placed in temporary housing arranged by Federal Victim Services, but they visited the ranch almost daily, drawn back to the place where their journey toward freedom had begun. The processing of the rescued workers took longer than anyone had anticipated. Each of the 60 people freed from the compound had their own story, their own trauma, their own complicated immigration status that had to be sorted out. Some had been brought to the country illegally and now faced the possibility of deportation back to the places they had fled. Others had valid work visas that had been confiscated by their captors, leaving them in a legal limbo that required endless paperwork to resolve. The federal government had established a task force specifically to handle the aftermath of the rescue, and Harold found himself serving as an unofficial liaison between the workers and the agencies trying to help them. It was during one of these meetings, about 3 weeks after the rescue, that Harold first heard the full extent of what his actions had uncovered. Special Agent Michelle Torres, the FBI agent leading the investigation, had asked to speak with him privately at the sheriff's office in Clearwater. She was a small woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Harold of the best ranch foreman he had worked with over the years. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "I wanted you to understand the significance of what you've helped us accomplish. When you first reported your concerns to Sheriff Patterson, we had no idea how big this organization was. We knew Marcus Webb was involved in trafficking, but we thought it was a relatively small operation. A few dozen victims, maybe, spread across 2 or 3 states." She opened a folder and spread several photographs across the table between them. These were taken during the raid on the compound, she continued.
But this is what we've found since then. Harold looked at the photographs and felt his stomach turn.
They showed other locations, other compounds similar to the one where he had been held. There were images of workers in fields and factories and construction sites, their faces carrying the same exhausted hopelessness that he had seen in Gabriel and Maria and Eduardo. There were documents showing financial records, money flows, connections to criminal organizations that stretched from Central America to Canada. The compound you found was just one node in a network that spans 5 states and 2 countries, Agent Torres explained. We've now identified 3 additional holding facilities, rescued over 200 additional victims, and arrested 37 people connected to the organization.
And we're not done yet.
The information we've gathered is leading us to even larger operations, trafficking networks we didn't even know existed a month ago. Harold sat in stunned silence, trying to process the scale of what he was hearing. He had started this journey hoping to help 3 workers who came to his ranch every day. He had never imagined that his simple act of noticing would ripple outward to touch the lives of hundreds of people across half a continent.
"Why are you telling me this?" he finally asked.
Agent Torres smiled, the first warm expression Harold had seen from her since they met.
"Because you deserve to know," she said simply. "And because there's something else I need to discuss with you."
She reached into her briefcase and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Inside was a stack of legal documents that Harold couldn't begin to decipher.
"This is paperwork for what's called a T-visa," Agent Torres explained.
"It's a special visa status for victims of human trafficking that allows them to remain in the United States legally and eventually apply for permanent residency. Gabriel, Maria, Eduardo, and many of the other workers are eligible for this protection."
"That's good news," Harold said, feeling a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "But why do you need to discuss it with me?"
"Because the T-visa process requires a sponsor, someone who can provide support and stability while the victims rebuild their lives.
Gabriel has specifically requested that you serve as his sponsor.
And, after reviewing your background and speaking with Sheriff Patterson about your character, we'd like to extend the same offer for any of the other victims who might need it." Harold stared at the documents, momentarily speechless. He had taken Gabriel into his home because it felt like the right thing to do, because the young man needed a safe place and Harold had one to offer. He hadn't expected the government to formalize that arrangement, to make him officially responsible for someone else's future in a way he had never been responsible for anyone except Martha. "I'm just an old rancher," Harold said slowly. "I don't know anything about immigration law or victim services or any of this. I wouldn't know how to begin helping these people with all the challenges they're facing." Agent Torres leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, you've already done more to help these people than most government agencies manage in years of operation.
You noticed when something was wrong. You asked questions when everyone else looked away.
You risked your life to gather evidence and, then, survived captivity to see the rescue through. If anyone is qualified to help these victims rebuild their lives, it's you." Harold thought about Gabriel, about the progress the young man had already made in just 3 weeks of living on the ranch. The nightmares that had plagued him those first few nights were becoming less frequent. The haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by something that looked almost like hope. And, just yesterday, Harold had caught him laughing at something he had read in a book from the ranch's small library, a genuine laugh that seemed to surprise Gabriel as much as it delighted Harold. He thought about Maria, who had shown such courage in reaching out to Jackson and setting the rescue in motion. She had told Harold just last week that she dreamed of becoming a nurse, of helping others the way she wished someone had helped her during the long years of her captivity. With the right support, the right opportunities, that dream could become real. He thought about Eduardo, the quiet older man who had protected the younger workers with the same fierce devotion that Harold had once felt for his cattle, for his ranch, for Martha. Eduardo had a family in Mexico that he hadn't seen in 6 years, a wife and 2 children who thought he was dead. The possibility of reuniting with them, of rebuilding the life that had been stolen from him, was almost too overwhelming to contemplate. All these people, all these dreams, all these futures waiting to unfold. And, somehow, through a series of events that still felt impossible when Harold thought about them, he had been placed at the center of it all. "I'll do it," Harold said. "Whatever paperwork needs to be signed, whatever responsibilities need to be accepted, I'll do it all. For Gabriel. For anyone else who needs it." Agent Torres smiled again, and, this time there was something in her expression that looked almost like admiration. "I had a feeling you'd say that," she said. "Sheriff Patterson said you were one of those rare people who actually means it when they say they want to help." The paperwork took several hours to complete, and, by the time Harold drove back to his ranch that evening, his hand was cramped from signing his name on what felt like hundreds of different documents. But, the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the sense of purpose that filled his chest, the feeling that his life had taken on a meaning it had lacked since Martha's passing. Gabriel was waiting for him on the front porch when he pulled up, sitting in the rocking chair that had been Martha's favorite spot for watching the sunset. The young man rose as Harold climbed out of his truck, his face showing concern at how late his sponsor had been. "Is everything okay?" Gabriel asked. "You were gone longer than you said." Harold climbed the porch steps and settled into the other rocking chair with a sigh of contentment. "Everything's fine," he said. "Better than fine, actually. I just spent the afternoon officially becoming responsible for your future. Hope you don't mind." Gabriel's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "The visa? They approved it?" "They approved it. And they want to know if any of the others want me to sponsor them too. Apparently, I've got a reputation now as someone who helps people." The young man sat back down in his chair, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something that looked almost like guilt. "You have done so much already," he said quietly. "You saved my life. You gave me a home. I do not want to be a burden on you." Harold reached over and put his hand on Gabriel's shoulder, the same gesture of comfort he had offered that morning in the barn when everything had started. "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You never could be. Martha and we could never have children of our own. It was something we grieved for a long time. But I think maybe, in some strange way, life was just waiting to give me a family when I was ready to appreciate it." Gabriel's eyes filled with tears that he made no effort to hide. "You are like a father to me," he said. "I had a father in Guatemala, a good man who sacrificed everything to give me what he thought would be a better life. But, these past weeks, living here with you, it has felt like having a father again. Like having family again." The two men sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Harold thought about how much his life had changed in such a short time, how the quiet routine of ranch work had been replaced by something far more complex and demanding. Some men might have resented the disruption, might have wished for the simpler days before Gabriel's limp had set everything in motion. But, Harold found that he wouldn't go back even if he could. The loneliness he had carried since Martha's death, the emptiness that had settled into his bones like a permanent ache, was finally beginning to lift. He had purpose again. He had people who needed him. He had family. The next morning brought more visitors, as had become the new normal at the Whitmore Ranch. Maria arrived early with fresh bread she had baked at the temporary housing facility, a skill she had learned from her mother in Guatemala and had nearly forgotten during her years of captivity. Eduardo came shortly after, bringing news that his contact with the Mexican consulate had finally yielded results, and that arrangements were being made to locate his family and begin the process of reunification. But, the most unexpected visitor of the day arrived just after noon, pulling up the long dirt driveway in a government vehicle that Harold didn't recognize. Sheriff Ray Patterson climbed out of the passenger side, and, from the driver's side emerged a woman Harold had never seen before. She was perhaps 50 years old, tall and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and an air of authority that suggested she was used to being in charge of whatever room she occupied. "Harold," Ray called out as they approached the porch. "There's someone here who wanted to meet you." The woman extended her hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "My name is Senator Catherine Brooks. I've been following your story very closely, and I wanted to come here personally to thank you for what you've done." Harold shook her hand, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the unexpected visit. "A senator. An actual United States senator standing on his porch, thanking him for doing what he had always believed was simply the right thing to do. I serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Brooks continued. For years, I've been trying to get more resources allocated to fighting human trafficking, more attention paid to the victims who suffer in silence while everyone looks the other way. But, it's hard to make people care about a problem they can't see. Your story has changed that. She gestured toward the road, where Harold could see more vehicles beginning to arrive. News vans, mostly, but also cars with government plates that suggested more officials were on their way. I've arranged a press conference, the senator explained. If you're willing, I'd like you to speak about what you witnessed, what you experienced, what needs to change so that stories like this don't happen again. Your voice carries weight right now, Mr. Whitmore. People want to hear from the quiet rancher who noticed what everyone else missed. You have the power to make them care about the problem in a way that all my speeches and legislation never could. Harold looked at Ray, who nodded encouragingly. Then, he looked at Gabriel, who had come to stand beside him on the porch. The young man's eyes were filled with something that Harold had come to recognize as pride, not pride in himself, but pride in the man who had given him a second chance at life. I'm not much of a speaker, Harold said slowly. Spent most of my life avoiding words when I could help it. Senator Brooks smiled. Sometimes the most powerful speakers are the ones who only talk when they have something important to say. That's exactly the kind of voice we need right now. Harold thought about all the other workers still trapped in compounds across the country, the ones who hadn't been rescued yet, the ones who might never be found without more attention, more resources, more people willing to pay attention the way he had. He thought about the trafficking networks that Agent Torres had described, the vast criminal enterprises that profited from human misery while hiding in plain sight. He thought about all the people who walked past suffering every day without a second glance, not because they were bad people, but because they had been trained to believe that other people's problems were not their concern. Maybe, just maybe, his voice could help change that. Maybe the silent rancher had one more thing to say after all. I'll do it, Harold said. But, I want Gabriel to speak too. And, Maria, if she's willing. This isn't my story. It's their story. They're the ones who deserve to be heard. Senator Brooks nodded approvingly. That's exactly right, she said. Their voices matter most of all. The press conference was held that afternoon, on the front porch of Harold's ranch house with the Montana mountains as a backdrop. Harold had never spoken in front of cameras before, had never felt the uncomfortable weight of hundreds of eyes focused on his face. But, as he stood at the makeshift podium that had been set up by the senator's staff, something strange happened. The words that had always been so difficult to find suddenly seemed to flow naturally, as if they had been waiting inside him all along, just needed the right moment to emerge. He talked about watching and noticing, about the way most people went through life missing the details that were hiding in plain sight. He talked about Gabriel's limp and Maria's scars and Eduardo's trembling hands, about all the small signs that something was terribly wrong. He talked about the fear he had felt and the courage he had found, about the partnership with Sheriff Patterson and the risks that Maria and Jackson had taken to make the rescue possible. And he talked about the work that still needed to be done, the victims who were still waiting to be found, the criminals who were still operating in the shadows. When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, Gabriel stepped up to the microphone and began to tell his own story. His voice trembled at first, heavy with emotions that had been suppressed for 6 long years. But, as he spoke, he grew stronger, more confident, more determined to make sure the world understood what he and the others had endured. He talked about the false promises that had lured him from Guatemala, the nightmare journey across the border, the years of forced labor and constant fear. He talked about the beatings, the threats, the hopelessness that had made him believe rescue would never come. And he talked about Harold, about the quiet kindness that had seemed so small at first but had ultimately proved powerful enough to bring down an entire criminal organization. Maria spoke next, her voice soft but steady. She talked about the courage it had taken to approach Jackson, to trust that this guard might be different from all the others who had turned a blind eye to their suffering. She talked about the moment when she had realized that freedom was actually possible, that the chains binding them were not as unbreakable as they had seemed. And she talked about what she wanted for her future, about the dreams she had almost given up on that were now within reach. The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours. When it was over, the reporters packed up their equipment and drove away, but the impact of what had happened that afternoon would continue to ripple outward for months to come. The story of the silent rancher and the workers he saved became national news, then international news. Harold received letters from people all over the world, people who had been inspired by his example, people who promised to pay more attention to the signs of suffering in their own communities. More importantly, the publicity led to real change. Senator Brooks used the momentum from the press conference to push through legislation that increased funding for anti-trafficking operations and improved protections for victims. Law enforcement agencies across the country launched new investigations based on leads that emerged from the Montana operation. And, in communities everywhere, ordinary people began to look a little more closely at the workers who maintained their yards and cleaned their houses and harvested their food, began to ask questions they had never thought to ask before. Harold watched all of this unfold with a mixture of amazement and humility. He had never wanted to be famous, had never sought attention or recognition. All he had done was notice something wrong and refuse to look away. That such a simple act could lead to such enormous consequences was still difficult for him to fully comprehend. But the consequences he cared about most were the ones he could see every day on his own ranch. Gabriel's nightmares had all but disappeared now, replaced by dreams of possibility and hope. The young man had started taking online classes, working toward the education that had been stolen from him when he was taken from Guatemala. He talked about becoming a social worker someday, about helping other trafficking victims the way he had been helped. Maria had enrolled in a nursing program at the community college in Clearwater, the first step toward the medical career she had dreamed about during all those years of captivity. She visited the ranch every weekend, bringing food and stories and the infectious energy of someone who had discovered that life could actually be good. Eduardo had finally been reunited with his family. Harold had driven him to the airport himself, had watched the older man walk through the security checkpoint toward a future that had seemed impossible just months before. The video call Eduardo made from Mexico, showing Harold, his wife and children gathered around him with tears streaming down their faces, was something Harold knew he would remember for the rest of his life. And Harold himself had changed too, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The silence that had defined him for so many years was still there, still a fundamental part of who he was. But now it felt different. It was no longer the silence of someone hiding from the world, avoiding connection and commitment. It was the silence of someone at peace, someone who had found his place in the larger story of human struggle and triumph. One evening, about 2 months after the rescue, Harold sat on his front porch watching the sunset with Gabriel beside him. The young man had brought out 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they had developed in the weeks since he moved into the ranch house. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned orange and pink and, finally, deep purple, the same sky Harold had watched for 63 years but somehow saw differently now. "Can I ask you something?" Gabriel said quietly. "Of course." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not noticed? If you had just looked away like everyone else?" Harold considered the question carefully before answering. "I used to wonder about that," he admitted. "In those first few days after you came to the ranch, when I was trying to convince myself that it wasn't my business, I thought about what it would be like to just ignore what I was seeing. To go back to my quiet life and pretend everything was fine. What stopped you?" Harold smiled softly, his eyes still fixed on the fading colors of the sunset. "Martha," he said simply. "My wife. She died 8 years ago, but I still talk to her sometimes, still ask her advice when I'm not sure what to do. And I knew what she would say. She would say that looking away from suffering is the same as causing it. That every time we choose not to notice, we're making a choice to let bad things happen." Gabriel nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom in Harold's words. "She sounds like she was a good person," he said. "The best person I ever knew," Harold replied. "And I think she would have liked you very much." They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to emerge. Somewhere out there, Harold knew, there were still people trapped in the same nightmare that Gabriel had escaped. There were still criminals profiting from human suffering, still victims waiting to be found.
The work of ending human trafficking would take years, maybe generations, to complete. But tonight, on this porch, in this moment, Harold allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten was possible. Contentment. The deep, quiet satisfaction of knowing that he had done something good, something that mattered, something that would echo forward into futures he would never see. The silent rancher had found his voice. And, in finding it, he had helped others find theirs too. That, Harold thought as he sipped his coffee and watched the stars wheel overhead, was worth more than all the words in the world. 6 months had passed since the night of the rescue, and the world had continued to turn in ways both predictable and surprising. The trial of Vincent Garrett and his associates was scheduled to begin in federal court the following month, and Harold had received notice that he would be called as a witness. The thought of testifying, of standing up in a courtroom and telling his story under oath, still made his stomach clench with anxiety. But he had made a promise to the workers he had helped save, a promise to see this through to the end, and Harold Whitmore was not a man who broke his promises. The ranch had settled into a new rhythm, different from the solitary routine Harold had known for so many years, but no less comfortable for its unfamiliarity. Gabriel had become a permanent presence in the old house, his energy and enthusiasm bringing life to rooms that had sat quiet and empty since Martha's passing. The young man had proven himself an excellent ranch hand, picking up the skills of cattle management with the same determination he brought to his online studies. Harold found himself teaching Gabriel things his own father had taught him decades ago, passing along knowledge that he had once thought would die with him. Maria came out to the ranch 3 or 4 times a week now, usually with armfuls of groceries and elaborate plans for meals that she insisted on cooking for Harold and Gabriel. Her nursing studies were going well, and she had recently started a clinical rotation at the hospital in Clearwater. The staff there had come to know her story, and many of them had gone out of their way to support her, offering mentorship and encouragement that meant more to Maria than they could possibly know. Eduardo's situation had taken a more complicated turn. His reunion with his family in Mexico had been everything he had dreamed of during his years of captivity, but it had also revealed challenges that no one had anticipated. His children, who had been young when he was taken, had grown into teenagers who barely remembered him. His wife had built a life without him, had become the sole provider for their family out of necessity, and struggled to readjust to sharing that role. The counselors working with trafficking victims had warned that reunification was often as difficult as separation, and Eduardo's experience was proving them right. But Eduardo was not a man who gave up easily. He had survived 6 years of forced labor and constant fear. He had found the courage to protect Maria and Gabriel when they needed protecting. And now he was finding the courage to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by circumstances beyond his control. He called Harold every Sunday evening from Mexico, sharing updates about his progress and asking for advice about everything from parenting to marriage to simply being patient with a process that couldn't be rushed. Harold cherished those phone calls. They reminded him that the ripples of his actions were still spreading outward, touching lives in ways he could see and ways he never would. Every person Eduardo helped during his own recovery, every future nursing patient Maria would care for, every life Gabriel would touch in his eventual career as a social worker, all of these were extensions of that moment when Harold had noticed a limping worker and decided to pay attention. The publicity from the case had not entirely faded, though it had settled into something more manageable. Harold still received letters and emails from people who had been moved by his story, and he did his best to respond to each one personally. Some were from other ranchers who wanted to know how they could check on the working conditions of the laborers in their area. Some were from victims of trafficking who had found hope in hearing that escape and recovery were possible. Some were from ordinary people who just wanted to thank him for reminding them that one person could make a difference. One letter in particular had arrived just last week, and Harold kept it in his shirt pocket where he could read it whenever he needed encouragement. It was from a woman in Texas named Rosa, who wrote that she had seen Harold's story on the news and had finally found the courage to report her own suspicions about workers at a construction site near her home. An investigation had followed, and 15 people had been rescued from conditions similar to what Gabriel and the others had endured. Rosa wanted Harold to know that his example had given her the strength to act, and that she would never forget what his courage had taught her about her own capacity for bravery. The letter meant more to Harold than all the media coverage and political attention combined.
This was what he had hoped for when he agreed to speak at the press conference, this ripple effect of awareness and action. He couldn't rescue every trafficking victim himself. But, maybe, by sharing his story, he could inspire others to notice, to pay attention, to refuse to look away from suffering just because it was easier not to see. The morning of the sheriff's department's ceremony dawned clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost coating the grass around Harold's ranch house. Gabriel helped him choose a tie, a task that took far longer than it should have because Harold hadn't worn a tie in so long that he had forgotten how to knot it properly. Maria arrived early to make sure Harold ate a proper breakfast, fussing over him like a mother hen despite his protests that he wasn't hungry. By the time they all piled into Harold's truck for the drive into Clearwater, the sun was well above the mountains and the frost was beginning to melt into glittering droplets on every surface. The ceremony was being held in the community center, a large building on the edge of town that had been decorated for the occasion with flags and banners. Harold was surprised by the size of the crowd that had gathered. It seemed like half the town had turned out, along with representatives from state and federal agencies, media crews from across the region, and a delegation of survivors from the trafficking operation who had wanted to witness this moment of recognition. Sheriff Ray Patterson met Harold at the entrance, looking more formal than Harold had ever seen him in a pressed uniform with all his medals displayed on his chest. The tired eyes that Harold had noticed at their first meeting were brighter now, filled with energy and purpose that made the 64-year-old lawman seem years younger. "Ready for this?" Ray asked with a knowing smile. "Not even a little bit," Harold admitted. "But I suppose that's never stopped me before." The ceremony began with speeches from various officials, words of praise and gratitude that made Harold squirm in his seat with discomfort. He had never sought recognition for what he had done, had never wanted to be singled out as special or heroic. He was just an old rancher who had paid attention when something seemed wrong. The fact that this simple act was being celebrated as extraordinary said more about the state of the world than it did about Harold's character. But then, Ray took the podium and began to speak, and something in his words made Harold sit up straighter and listen more carefully. "I've been a lawman for 32 years, Ray said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded room. "In that time, I've seen the best and worst of what human beings are capable of. I've seen acts of violence that kept me awake at night, and I've seen acts of kindness that restored my faith in humanity. But I have never, in all my years of service, witnessed anything quite like what Harold Whitmore did." He paused, letting his words settle over the audience. Most people, when they see something wrong, convince themselves that it's not their problem. They tell themselves that someone else will handle it, that getting involved is too risky, too complicated, too likely to disrupt their comfortable lives. Harold could have done that. He had every excuse in the world to look away from what was happening to the workers on his ranch. He was an old man living alone, with no experience in criminal investigation, no resources, no backup. The smart thing to do would have been to mind his own business and hope the problem went away. Ray's eyes found Harold in the crowd, and the two men shared a moment of understanding that transcended words. But Harold didn't do the smart thing. He did the right thing. He noticed when others didn't. He asked questions when others were silent. He risked his own safety to gather evidence that would eventually bring down a criminal organization spanning multiple states. And, when he was captured and held prisoner, he never gave up hope, never stopped believing that rescue was possible. The sheriff stepped away from the podium and walked toward where Harold was seated. In his hands was a small velvet box that Harold hadn't noticed before. "On behalf of the Clearwater County Sheriff's Department," Ray said, "I am honored to present Harold Whitmore with the Civilian Medal of Valor, our highest recognition for non-law enforcement individuals who demonstrate exceptional courage in the service of their community." He opened the box to reveal a bronze medal on a red and blue ribbon, inscribed with words that Harold couldn't quite read from his seat. The crowd erupted in applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Harold felt Gabriel's hand on his shoulder, heard Maria crying softly beside him, saw the faces of dozens of trafficking survivors watching him with gratitude that made his chest ache. He stood slowly, his old knees protesting the sudden movement, and walked toward where Ray was waiting. The sheriff pinned the medal to Harold's chest with hands that trembled slightly, whether from emotion or age Harold couldn't tell. Then, Ray stepped back and saluted, a gesture of respect that took Harold completely by surprise.
"I've waited 32 years to meet someone like you," Ray said, loud enough for the microphone to pick up his words. "Someone who proved that ordinary people really can change the world. Thank you, Harold. From all of us." Harold looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces watching him expectantly, waiting for him to say something meaningful. Public speaking had never been his strength. Words had always felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the eloquence of silence. But these people deserved something, some acknowledgement of what this moment meant and what it represented. He cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. "My wife Martha used to say that the world is made up of two kinds of people. Those who notice things and those who don't. She was one of the ones who noticed. She saw beauty where others saw nothing special. She saw pain where others saw only strangers. She saw possibility where others saw only problems." His voice caught for a moment, and he had to pause to collect himself. "I spent most of my life trying to be like her. Trying to see the world the way she did. And, for a long time, I thought I was failing. I thought being silent meant I wasn't paying attention, wasn't making a difference. But then, Gabriel came to my ranch with a limp and a bruise, and I realized that watching is its own kind of action. Noticing is its own kind of courage." He looked at Gabriel, who was watching him with tears streaming freely down his face. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what Martha would have done. I paid attention. I refused to look away. And, when I saw something wrong, I did whatever I could to make it right. That's all any of us can do. That's all any of us need to do." Harold stepped back from the microphone, signaling that he was finished. But, before the applause could resume, Gabriel stood up and asked if he could say something. The master of ceremonies looked uncertain for a moment, then nodded and gestured for Gabriel to approach. The young man walked to the podium with the careful dignity of someone who had learned hard lessons about survival and was only now beginning to understand what it meant to thrive. He looked out at the crowd with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity but still chose to believe in the best. "In my country, there is a saying," Gabriel began. "The man who plants a tree under whose shade he will never sit is the true giver. Harold Whitmore is such a man. He risked everything for people he did not know, for strangers from another country who had nothing to offer him in return. He could not know that his actions would lead to the rescue of hundreds of people. He could not know that his story would inspire others to notice what they had been trained not to see. He only knew that something was wrong, and that he had the power to do something about it." Gabriel turned to look at Harold, and the love and gratitude in his expression was almost too much for the old rancher to bear. "Harold has become like a father to me," Gabriel continued. "He has given me a home, an education, a future that I had stopped believing was possible. But, more than that, he has given me an example of what it means to be a good person. Not a perfect person. Not a hero. Just a good person who pays attention and cares about the suffering of others." He faced the crowd again, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I ask all of you to remember this day. Not because Harold received a medal, but because his story shows us what is possible when ordinary people refuse to be bystanders. Every one of you has the power to notice. Every one of you has the power to act. The question is whether you will choose to use that power, or whether you will convince yourselves that someone else will handle it." Gabriel paused, collecting his thoughts for a final statement. "Harold Whitmore is proof that one person can change the world. But he would be the first to tell you that he didn't do it alone. It took a sheriff who listened. It took federal agents who investigated. It took a guard who found his conscience. It took workers who risked everything to trust a stranger. And it took a community that cared enough to show up today and celebrate what courage looks like." He stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat beside Harold. The old rancher put his arm around the young man's shoulders, and they sat together as the crowd rose once again in thunderous applause. Maria was openly sobbing now, and even some of the hardened law enforcement officers in attendance were wiping their eyes. The ceremony continued with additional presentations and speeches, but Harold barely heard any of it. His mind was already drifting toward the future, toward all the work that still needed to be done.
The trial would be starting soon, and his testimony would be crucial in ensuring that Vincent Garrett and his associates faced justice. Beyond that, there were still trafficking networks operating in the shadows, still victims waiting to be found, still criminals profiting from human misery. But there were also people fighting back. The FBI task force had expanded its operations based on the evidence gathered from the Montana compound. New legislation was making its way through Congress that would provide more resources for investigation and victim services. And, across the country, ordinary people were beginning to pay more attention to the workers in their communities, asking questions that had never been asked before. The ripples were spreading. The seeds that Harold had planted were beginning to grow. And, maybe, just maybe, Martha was watching from somewhere beyond the pale blue sky, proud of the man her husband had become. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the community center where people lined up to shake Harold's hand and share their own stories of how his example had affected them. A young couple told him about calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline after noticing suspicious activity at a restaurant where they often ate, leading to an investigation that was still ongoing. An elderly woman described how she had started volunteering with a local refugee assistance organization, wanting to do her part to help newcomers adjust to life in America. A teenager explained that he was writing his college application essay about Harold's story, about what it meant to be a true hero in a world that often celebrated the wrong kind of heroism. Harold listened to each story with the same quiet attention he had brought to everything in his life. He offered words of encouragement where he could, mostly just nodded and let the speakers know that he had heard them, that their experiences mattered. It was exhausting in a way he hadn't anticipated, this constant engagement with strangers who saw him as something more than he felt himself to be. But it was also deeply satisfying, confirmation that his actions had set something larger in motion than he could ever accomplish alone. By the time the reception ended and Harold could finally escape to the relative quiet of his truck, the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains. Gabriel and Maria climbed in beside him, and the three of them sat in tired silence as Harold navigated the familiar roads back toward the ranch. About halfway home, Maria spoke up from the back seat. "I want to do more," she said. "The nursing program is good, but it feels like it is not enough. I want to help other survivors, people who went through what we went through. I want to be there for them the way Harold was there for us." Harold glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What are you thinking?" "I have been talking with some of the counselors at the Victim Services Organization," Maria said. "They told me about a program where survivors can train to become advocates for other trafficking victims. It would mean more school, more training, more time before I can start my career. But I feel like it is what I am supposed to do." Harold nodded slowly. "Then, that's what you should do," he said simply. "Life is too short to spend doing anything less than what you feel called to do." Gabriel spoke up then, his voice thoughtful. "I have been thinking about this too. My social work studies, they are good preparation, but I want to do something more direct. Maybe start an organization that helps survivors find employment, learn new skills, rebuild their lives. Something like what Harold did for us, but on a larger scale." "You should talk to Senator Brooks," Harold suggested. She mentioned something about a new foundation being established to support trafficking survivors. "Might be she could connect you with the right people." The conversation continued as they drove through the darkening countryside, three people from different generations and backgrounds united by shared experience and common purpose. By the time they reached the ranch, they had sketched out the beginnings of a plan that would eventually become something remarkable. It would take years, of course. Gabriel would finish his social work degree and, then, pursue a master's in nonprofit management. Maria would complete her nursing training and, then, enroll in the survivor advocacy program she had mentioned. Together, with Harold's guidance and the support of the broader network they had built, they would establish an organization called Notice, dedicated to education, prevention, and survivor support in the fight against human trafficking. The organization would grow to have chapters in 12 states, helping thousands of survivors rebuild their lives and training countless ordinary citizens to recognize the signs of trafficking in their own communities. But all of that was in the future. For now, on this cold evening in Montana, they were just three people sitting on a porch watching the stars emerge, grateful to be alive and free and together. Harold, Gabriel said after a long silence.
Do you ever regret it? Any of it?
The old rancher considered the question carefully before answering. I regret that it took me so long to act, he said finally. 2.5 years I watched you suffer before I found the courage to do something.
That's time I can never give back to you. Gabriel shook his head.
If you had acted sooner, things might have gone differently.
The federal agents might not have been ready. The evidence might not have been there. We might have been moved to another location and never found. Everything happened the way it was supposed to happen. I believe that.
Harold wasn't sure he agreed with the theology behind Gabriel's statement, but he appreciated the sentiment.
Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe everything does happen for a reason.
Or maybe things just happen, and it's up to us to make meaning out of them.
Either way, Maria said softly, we are here now. And that is enough.
They sat together as the night deepened around them, three survivors of different kinds of trials, bound together by something stronger than blood or circumstance. The metal on Harold's chest caught the light from the kitchen window, a reminder of what he had accomplished and what still remained to be done. But the weight of it felt less burdensome now than it had during the ceremony. He was beginning to accept that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to be recognized for what he had done.
Martha would have been proud.
That thought kept returning to him, a constant thread woven through all the changes of the past 6 months. She would have been proud of the courage he had found, of the family he had built, of the difference he had made in the lives of people she would never meet. And, somehow, in a way Harold couldn't quite explain, he felt her presence beside him still.
Watching. Noticing.
Loving him across the distance between this world and whatever came next. The next morning, Harold woke early as always and made his way to the kitchen to start the coffee. Gabriel was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and a textbook open in front of him. The young man looked up as Harold entered and smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Good morning, Harold, Gabriel said.
Sleep well?
Well enough, Harold replied.
You?
I dreamed about my father, Gabriel said softly.
Not the nightmares I used to have. A good dream.
He was standing in a field of green grass, waving at me, telling me he was proud of how far I had come. Harold poured his coffee and sat down across from Gabriel.
Your father loved you very much, he said.
He sacrificed everything to give you a chance at a better life. Even though things didn't work out the way he planned, that love is still with you.
Always will be.
Gabriel nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears.
I know, he said.
And I know he would be grateful to you. For finishing what he started.
For giving me the life he wanted me to have.
They sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose over the eastern mountains, casting golden light across the kitchen. Through the window, Harold could see his cattle grazing in the pasture, going about their simple routines as they had done every morning for as long as he could remember. Life on the ranch continued, unchanged by all the drama that had unfolded over the past year.
The fences still needed mending.
The cattle still needed feeding. The seasons still turned in their eternal cycle of birth and death and renewal. But Harold was changed. He knew that now, could feel it in his bones the way he felt the approach of winter or the promise of spring.
The silent rancher who had spent 63 years watching from the sidelines had finally stepped into the arena.
And, though the battle was far from over, though there was still so much work to be done, he knew that he would never go back to being the man he had been before.
The world was full of people who needed someone to notice them.
It was full of suffering that hid in plain sight, waiting for anyone brave enough to look closely and ask questions.
Harold couldn't save everyone. No one could.
But he could keep paying attention. He could keep watching and noticing and caring. He could keep being the example that Martha would have wanted him to be. And, maybe, if enough people followed that example, if enough ordinary people found the courage to refuse to look away, the world itself might slowly begin to change. Not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through countless small moments of attention and care, rippling outward across time and space to touch lives that none of them would ever know. That was the lesson Harold Whitmore had learned in his 63 years of watching the world. The lesson he would spend, however, many years he had left trying to share with anyone willing to listen.
Notice. Pay attention. Refuse to look away. It was that simple. And it was that hard. But it was enough. It was always enough.
Outside the kitchen window, the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the Montana grasslands. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark began to sing, its clear notes carrying across the still air. Harold closed his eyes and listened, letting the sound wash over him like a benediction. Life was good. Not perfect, never perfect, but good. And, for an old rancher who had spent most of his years in silence, that was more than he had ever dared to hope for. The story that had begun with a limping worker on a cold October morning was not over.
It would never really be over.
But, this chapter, at least, had reached its natural conclusion. The silent rancher had found his voice. The captives had found their freedom. And, the sheriff's department had found in Harold Whitmore an example of everything that ordinary citizens could achieve when they simply decided to pay attention. As Harold opened his eyes and looked across the table at Gabriel, at the young man who had become like a son to him, he felt something settle into place deep in his chest. Not pride, exactly, though there was some of that. Not satisfaction, though he felt that too. It was something quieter, something more profound. It was peace. And, for Harold Whitmore, the silent rancher who had finally learned to speak when it mattered most, that peace was the greatest reward of all.